are this interested in learning a little bit more about the basics of primates. And what I'm going to do today is quite fundamental, just laying the foundations of what kind of species you find in India, a little bit about their behavior and conservation. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so just to conserve bandwidth, I'm going to put my video off. I hope I'm audible to everybody. If I'm not, please drop a message in the chat box and I'll talk louder or come closer to the mic or something like that. Right, so today I'm going to give you a basic introduction to non-human primates of India, and I insisted that Sai put in the term non-human into the title because I think it's important for us all to be well aware of the fact that we too are primates and we do share a lot of characteristics with the kind of wildlife we see in our country. So before I delve into the India picture of things, I'd like to ask us, what is a primate? So there are many different ways to describe what a primate is, and this is something that we are still figuring out as we go ahead. This isn't something that has a very concrete definition that we can put simply into a single sentence. Primates are largely terrestrial mammals, and they evolved about somewhere between 80 to 55 million years ago, and they came from tree-dwelling animals in tropical forests. And there are so many species of primates. Right now, there are over 400 species, but we're still discovering new species as we go along. A lot of primate species are also threatened and endangered, and we're also losing species faster than we can actually discover new ones. And this entire range of primate species can, you find species as little as 30 grams and as large as 200 kgs. So there's a very vast spectrum within the primate world as well. There are also some there's like a whole bunch of characteristics that a primate could have. You see that over the course of evolution, most primate species have evolved larger brains than their ancestors, both in size and complexity. They also have binocular and color vision, which means they have these forward facing eyes, and their vision and optic systems are very similar to ours. They have dexterous hands, which means they have hands which can grasp things and modify tools and other structures and hold on to things, unlike many other mammal species. They're also largely social. Most primate species live in groups and families and have very complex social dynamics. Most primates also have tails of varying lengths. They have opposable thumbs, just like we do. You see sexual dimorphism, which means that the males and females look different from one another. They have prehensile feet and hands, which means they can plan and use them for various tasks. They have flattened nails, just like we do, and not claws like most animals do. And they also show some amount of postnatal dependency, which means that even after an infant is born, the mother takes care of it for an extended period of time until it's ready to be independent and feed itself and move on its own and make its own decisions. Of course, you won't find each and every one of these characteristics in every primate species. Different species have a combination of them. But this is the umbrella of characteristics that a primate could have. They're also very closely related to humans, and in the current climate of things, it's also important to keep in mind that because we are so closely linked genetically and evolutionarily, it could also lead to a transmission of zoonotic diseases between and across species. And that's something that we should bear in mind, not for our own safety alone, but also for that of endangered primates across the world. So in the entire world, there are two large orders of primates, which means there are these two categories in which all of the primate species in the world fall. One is the prosimians, which largely comprises of lemurs, lorises, and tarsiers. And you can see the pictures here in the order in which they've been written. There are also the anthropoids, which consist of monkeys like macaques and langurs, leaf monkeys. You have the great apes and hominids like gibbons, the orangutan, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. And there's also man. That's a picture of Jane Goodall, who's probably one of the first in-depth primatologists that the world saw, and she studied chimpanzees in Africa. So coming down to India, what are the groups that we have here? So you can largely categorize all of the species you find in our country into 4 groups. The first one is the small and round-eyed lorises. You also have short to medium-tailed macaques. You have the long-tailed langurs, and you have tailless gibbons. Now, primate classification is very largely dependent on the morphology, which means the outer appearance, the anatomy, which includes their bone structures, and the organization of the different systems in their body, largely the reproductive system. So this is how the overarching classification of primates is done. The next class of categorization is done based on their size and habitat, and lastly in terms of their behavior. So small and round-eyed lorises are very interesting creatures which are found in mainly tropical forests, but also found in some semi-urban to urban areas in very tiny pockets. Those of you who are from Bangalore will be aware that there are a couple of small populations of lorises in North Bangalore, largely near GKVK and the IISc campuses, which still have some islands of greenery. There's also the macaques, which are typically forest species and require a large amount of greenery and forest cover, but they are also the most adaptable group of primates that we have, which means that even in the event of very rapid changes in their environment and habitat, they're still able to modify their behavior and to come up with new survival strategies to live in these places. We also have the long-tailed langurs, which aren't as adaptable as the macaques are, but some species still do very well in the presence of humans. And then, of course, there's the tailless gibbons, which are one of the most endangered species that we have in our country. And they are also the only ape species that we have. So how many primates are there in our country? This is something that is constantly debated and contested. The last official publication and guidebook mentions that we have 22 species of primates in this country. And that's the classification that I'm going to be following for today's talk. Although there have been literature reviews and compilations of various records that say that there are up to 25 species. And a lot of this confusion and debate stems from the classification of langur species in the country, because many of them are similar to each other, and there is a constant battle between many taxonomists about whether certain primates fall under the same species or there are 2 or 3 different ones based on where they are located in the country. So that also indirectly answers my next question of how much do we actually know. There are a few primate species in the country that are very well studied, but by and large, we still lack in in-depth knowledge of every species that exists. So apart from some baseline knowledge about where the monkeys are found and a general idea of their populations, we don't know enough about the behavior and the threats and conservation issues that face a lot of these species today. So if any of you listening in are people inclined towards studying primatology one way or the other, you should keep an eye out for this and try to fill in some of the gaps in knowledge that we still have. So now I'm going to go into the different species that we have just to show you what is there in our country. So I'm going to start with the first group of small round-eyed lorises. We have 2 species in this group in our country. One is the Bengal slow loris, and the second is the gray slender loris. Now, these species are extremely interesting because they are unique. You find them in the south of India along the Western Ghats and a little bit along the Eastern Ghats as well, and in Northeast India, coming down a little bit into West Bengal. And this is a family, it's a very small, furry, nocturnal primate. It's got these really large eyes that dominate most of its face, and because it's nocturnal and it spends most of its time in these low light conditions, it's evolved these large eyes to help them utilize best whatever little light they have available to them. So here the males are usually much larger than the females, but it is very hard to separate which one is male and female unless you see them close together. So yeah, so you'll usually see them in subtropical or semi-tropical evergreen forests, and usually they are common in lower altitudes. They don't go very high up. Um, yeah, so they're usually, they also don't create large groups. They usually move around in pairs or alone at night while foraging. The next group of primates in the country is the small to medium tailed macaques. So these guys are extremely diverse, very widespread, and altogether they occupy pretty much every habitat that the country has to offer, from mangroves to coastal areas to very rich evergreen forests to deciduous forests to grasslands to urban areas and even agricultural areas. So there's very little of India that does not have one or more of these macaque species. So there is the Nicobar long-tailed macaque here on the top left. This is the macaque that I am very partial to because I've had the fortune of studying this species. They're found on 3 of the Nicobar Islands, which is part of that long strip of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And I'd say that as a country, we are lucky to have had them. And it's a bit of a biogeographic marvel because they've technically come from Southeast Asia, and you find most of their cousins in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, those areas. Um, there's also just under that the Assamese macaque. This is also a very interesting species which is becoming increasingly rare. It's found only in Northeast India, and their populations are dropping, as we speak. There is a lot of hunting and other threats in those areas, and I'll speak about it in more detail towards the end of the talk. So it is a heavy, thick-set forest macaque, and it's got these dark chocolate brown like fur which gets paler as the year goes along, and depending on their age as well. So and it also is one of those macaques that utilizes the forest floor a lot, which also makes it susceptible to hunting and other predators. Similarly is the Arunachal macaque, and this is the macaque that was most recently discovered. It's called the Munzala locally, which is why its scientific name is Macaca munzala. And this is again a very beautiful macaque, and it's found in a very, very tiny part of the Northeast India in Western Arunachal Pradesh. So you'll find them in Tawang, and they're even found at high altitudes like 3,000 meters above sea level. So this is a small population of primates that was recently discovered and described, and we still know painfully little about the species. The other two are ones which probably everybody on this call has encountered at some point. One is the rhesus macaque, and this is currently the most widely spread species in the country. They are extremely adaptable. They can make use of any environment that they find themselves in, and they also breed very rapidly. So the rhesus macaque is found in North India, coming into southern to middle of India, the peninsula, and the bonnet macaque is largely found in South India. So there was a very clear distinction in their ranges of occurrence initially, but over time we are observing that the rhesus macaque is reproducing at a higher rate than the bonnet macaque. It's a little more adaptable, and in any direct competition between these two species, the rhesus macaque usually tends to drive the bonnet macaque away, and it claims more and more of the bonnet territory. So you do see rhesus macaques gradually moving further down south. The other three species in this group are the stump-tailed macaque. The stump-tailed macaque is also a very interesting species, and this species is largely found in northeast India to the south of the river Brahmaputra. So the Brahmaputra in northeast India forms a physical barrier for many species. So you'll often find them either to the north of it or to the south, but very rarely across both. So for example, the rhesus macaque is one that you would find very widely distributed regardless of these physical boundaries. It's a very cool species. It's got a very tiny tail, which kind of looks like what the docked tail of some of these hunting dog species look like, sorry, dog breeds. And it's largely on the forest floor. It forages for fallen fruit, for many different kinds of insects and small amphibians, and it also eats a lot of leaves and seeds. So that's a very interesting species, which again has not been studied too well so far. Below that, you find the northern pigtailed macaque, and the pigtailed macaque has two subspecies. This is one of them, the northern pigtailed macaque, and India just about made the cut to have the species included in it. Its sister subspecies is found lower down in Southeast Asia, around Malaysia and those areas. You also find them in some of the tropical islands like Borneo. Then there is the lion-tailed macaque, or Macaca silenus, and this is probably India's flagship primate species. It's quite endangered, and it's something that has become a conservation symbol over time. This is a largely tree-dwelling species, which you find in the Western Ghats forests. And there also, it's not through the entire Western Ghats, it's in southern Karnataka and a bit of Kerala. And you'll find that these primates require heavy tree cover and canopy density to properly thrive. This macaque is also unique in the kind of troop it forms, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So you also find that because of pressures from human development and forest fragmentation and habitat loss, these primates who were initially completely forest bound are in the past 20 years starting to make their way towards urban areas as well. And now there's actually a troop of macaques that has completely urbanized and resides within village boundaries in Puduthottam near Valparai. There's also long-tailed langurs, which is the third category of primates you find in the country. So this category is perhaps the least studied of all the primates in the country. And apart from their distribution and ranges, we know very, very little about it. There are, of course, one or two species that have really stood out and have gained more interest academically than others due to them being more rare and also a lot more attractive physically. So we know a little more about those. So we'll start with the southeastern langur, which is on the top left. So the southeastern langur is it's probably one that you've seen around, depending on which part of India you live in. These langurs are, again, langurs in general are folivorous, which means they feed largely on leaves, and this is true across all of the species. And in fruiting seasons, they also eat a little bit of fruit for sugar and other energy sources. Once in a while, they also eat insects and anything else that they can really get their hands on, especially in summer when there aren't as many fresh green leaves available. So some of the langur species, including the southeastern langur, have also made their way closer into urban areas, and you'll also find them around many prominent temples. There's the Kashmir or Chamba langur, who is found way up north, and you can tell from its really thick fuzzy coat that it lives in areas which are quite cold and are of higher altitudes that face very harsh winters. There's the golden langur, which is definitely a favorite to study among primatologists who look at langurs, and they are largely found, in near between the rivers of Manas and Sankosh in the district of Assam. For those who are aware of where those are, and they have a very small, limited range. Again, they are quite threatened by habitat fragmentation, which is a problem, and they're very very distinct to find and identify because they've got this rich golden coat which really shines in the sun, especially when you're following them during the day. There's also the Fire's leaf monkey, and this is a species that is very similar to the dusky leaf monkey found in Southeast Asia, and it's one of the many subspecies of the spectacled monkey group. We also find down south in the Nilgiris, the Nilgiri langur. It's a very, very beautiful monkey. It's got this very, very shiny black coat, an extremely long tail, and a very distinct mane, which is golden to brownish. The males and females are alike, and you won't find much sexual dimorphism there. Along with the lion-tailed macaque, the Nilgiri langur occurs in very similar habitats, and just like them, requires a contiguous forest in order to properly persist and survive. And forest fragmentation does not work well for them. And this is a forest species which is relatively shy, that it would be very unusual to see them move out of forest areas and into any kind of urban settlements. The southwestern langur and the northern plains langur, both very similar in appearance, are largely what do you say, separated out taxonomically based on where they are found. So you can tell from the names around where in the country you would find them. They are the ones that you would have most definitely seen along highways, in temples, or any urban areas which attract a lot of tourists. There's the capped langur, which shares a lot of its habitat with the golden langur, but is a little more populous and a lot more easily found than them. They're again really beautiful species, and apart from the rest of the golden coat similar to the golden langur, they also have a very typical brown crest, which is why it gets its name, the capped langur. There's also the Terai langur, which we know very little about, and the Himalayan langur, which is found in Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and the middle range of the Himalayas. It's again, just like the Terai and Kashmir langur, you'll see that it's got a very dense coat, and this is for it to survive in these really, really harsh climates. Sorry, yeah. And the last category is the tailless gibbons. And India has two species of this gibbon. One is the western Hoolock gibbon and the eastern Hoolock gibbon. And what you can tell from these images is that this is the first primate species we've spoken about that has such clear sexual dimorphism, which means that the males and females are extremely distinct from one another. The females have this very beige coat, while the males are fully black and they've got really prominent eyebrows and face markings. This sexual dimorphism is something you would find from an early age, so even infants will be colored based on their sex. They're called Hoolock gibbons because they are found extremely high up in the canopy. They are entirely arboreal. They move through the canopy like acrobats. They're truly such a joy to watch. And so you'll also find that um, yeah, so there is these dipterocarps, which are the Hoolock tree, and they're extremely tall. And in the areas where they are found in Northeast India, they largely use these extremely tall dipterocarps, which is where they get their name. So just to do a glance over at all of the species that we find in our country, We have roughly 22 species, like I mentioned, and each occupy various niches. And when I say niche, I mean that they occupy different areas of a forest and ecosystem, both in terms of the physical space they occupy and the behavior that they exhibit and the kind of role that they fill in that ecosystem to keep it running. The biggest primate we have is the Himalayan langur, and in fact, it looks even bigger in appearance because of its big, heavy coat, especially in the winters. The smallest primate we have is the gray slender loris. The most common is the rhesus and bonnet, which I'm quite certain everybody here would have seen at least once. And the most endangered primate that we have is the western hoolock gibbon. And this is also because they are highly, highly specialized creatures. Creatures that are specialized means that they require a very particular kind of habitat, diet, and general environment in order to survive, because they have evolved to that specificity. A generalist, on the other hand, is an animal that can adapt and survive in any kind of environment and make the best use of its surroundings. So typically, you will find that specialists are more endangered than generalists in any species group, even apart from primates. So just to tell you a little bit about niches in a forest. So if you are in a forest or you're on a trek, at what part of the forest would you look for various species? So if you look at the topmost section of the canopy, really high up in a tropical forest is where you would find species like the gibbon. Coming a little lower from that, and but still pretty high up, you would find species like the lorises. From about mid to high canopy up onto the ground is where you would find a lot of the langur species. And finally, from mid canopy to the ground is where you would find most of your macaque species. So now that we've kind of gone over each of the species that occurs in our country, I'm also going to talk a little bit about how the different behaviors of primates characterize them and are unique to that large group of mammals. And this is where most of the fun begins for primatologists, where you really get into the depths of the kind of behaviors that they exhibit. And you will find that most of primates show all of these behaviors, and of course, depending on what species group they belong to, they exhibit them in various ways. So I'm going to go over each of these sections. So first, let's talk about social organization in primates. So I'm going to explain this in detail. Don't get intimidated by all the symbols yet. So like I mentioned earlier, all primates are very social, and their large brains also go towards um, maneuvering this social complexity that is their everyday life. So there are three large ways in which social organization in primates works, and different species fall into each of these categories. So to begin with, we can talk about solitary ones. Solitary primates are primates that largely move around entirely alone, both the males and the females. So the orangutan is a really good example of this, where you won't find them in large groups, but you'll only find males and females moving around separately. They come together only when it is time to mate. And the only other time you would find more than one primate together is when a mother is taking care of its child before it leaves her for its own solitary life. The next category of organization is for them to be in pairs or in nuclear families, just like what most humans live like in today's time and age. So you would have a male and female living together, moving together, foraging together, and their entire social interaction would only be with one another. And of course, they would have their own territory apart from the next nuclear family. And within the family, up until the infants grow up to an age where they can care for themselves, they will form that family together. And gibbons or indris, which is a species of lemur, are found to fall into this category. The last and the most common is that of permanent associations. And this is what we see largely in India. So apart from gibbons, in India, all of our primate species fall under permanent associations. Sorry, gibbons and a lot of lorises that also fall under solitary or pair. So permanent associations or troops of macaques can be can associate can consist of many males and many females. It could be one male and many females, and of course the children that are born as a result of this family living. And what's really interesting to see when it comes to social organization and in permanent associations in primate species is that of social hierarchy. So it's not just a large group of primates existing together and having a single home range that is just theirs, but within each group, there's a very complex and dynamic social hierarchy. So typically, there's a different hierarchy for all of the females in the troop, and there's a different hierarchy for all of the males in the troop. So the most typical manner in which this works is within females, it is matriarchal and matrilineal. So a highly dominant female, her daughter is automatically part of the higher dominance in that group. Whereas in males, who your parents are makes no bears no relevance. It is how strong you are, how fit you are, and how well you rise in the hierarchy yourself that really matters. So in these troops, in order to maintain these hierarchies, what you will find is that new female infants that are born to a troop remain within the troop, and new males that are born tend to move away from the troop and join outside troops when they are of an able age. So this is the basics of social organization in primates, and I'm happy to explain further if you have questions later. Moving on to the next part of primates is that of reproduction. So there are many reproductive strategies that you find across primate species in the world. In India, what you find are species of old world monkeys, and this is something that uh, it, that refers to the manner in which evolution of primates and their distribution across the globe occurred. So old world monkeys are those that evolved first and form the basis of the genetic material that most primate species consist of. So all of these old world monkeys are seasonal breeders, which means they go through cycles of reproduction in a year, unlike humans which don't have a cycle. And a female human being can get pregnant at any time of year, which is not always the case in old world monkeys. Their gestation period ranges from anywhere like, oh, I'm so sorry, this should be switched, about 3 months in macaques to about 7 months in langurs. They also have many unique breeding strategies, and this is something that they do in order to boost reproductive success. So there are a bunch of technical terms here which I will explain. So we'll start with cryptic estrus. So in multi-male, multi-female troops, what's interesting is that there's always a competition for which male gets to mate with which female, much like you will see even in the human world, right? So males which are higher up in the hierarchy will want to mate with those higher up in the hierarchy as well. But that doesn't mean that individuals that are lower down in the hierarchy do not want to mate with those higher up in the hierarchy as well. So one way that females deal with this is by hiding when they are in estrus. So there's no clear signaling sometimes between females to show that they are receptive for mating and that they're ready to mate. And by doing this, it kind of suppresses the competition, because when the most competitive individuals are not aware that you're receptive for mating, then there won't be much fight about it, and you can quietly mate with the individual of your choice. And just so estrus is basically like the menstrual cycle in humans. There's the estrus cycle in primates. There's also estrus synchrony, which is when at the same time all of the females in a troop become receptive together. So this is another way to combat competition, where if you just flood the system with product, just like you would in economics, uh, there is enough choice, and thus there will be a mate for everybody, and there is a much higher productivity of mating occurring. There are also coalitions. So coalitions are interesting because this also includes males, and they are the ones who will spend time gradually to form long-lasting bonds with specific females and court them up until they are receptive for mating. So there is a guarantee that they are the ones that would mate with that female. So yeah, so continuing from coalitions, there's also two opposing strategies that a male can employ. One is that of greater mate choice. So greater mate choice has a lot to do with where you are in the hierarchy of a troop, and whether you are the one that gets first pickings. Another is of breeding monopoly. So remember when I told you about the the lion-tailed macaques in South India, and how they consist of troops which are of a single male and multiple females. So in such an organization, you have a breeding monopoly where that one male is the only male that all the females could potentially mate with. So there is absolutely no argument of who the father of all of the infants in that group are. So sometimes, in order to combat this, which may not always be genetically the best thing, just like how people tend not to marry within families and communities, and there is some amount of mixing that occurs. Similarly, all primates tend to try and mix it up genetically. So what they also try to do is have paternity confusion. So what paternity confusion is when a female mates with multiple males, and so all of the males that she mates with is not entirely sure whether they are the father of the infant that results from that mating or not. So suppose a female mates with 4 males. Each of those males is aware of the fact that the probability that they are the father is only 1/4. So the amount of investment that the father would put into that uh, is would be 1/4 of their effort, as opposed to a breeding monopoly kind of a situation where there's absolutely no doubt of who the father is, and so there's 100% probability that that is his infant, and then he can go on to provide that kind of care. There is also some amount of infanticide which happens in a lot of primate species, which is something done in order to mate again to ensure your paternity this time. It's also something that is done to eliminate competition, especially if the infant is a male, and higher ranking males do not want other males from a good dominant female to take over their place in the group. So I know a lot of this is also a little bit complicated, but again, you can ask me questions later if you have any. So foraging and provisioning in primates is something that's quite interesting. Like I mentioned, macaques are extremely adaptable and they utilize many different resources. Most primates are omnivorous except the langurs and gibbons, and which means that they are opportunistic in what they eat. So a typical forest macaque would eat a lot of fruits. They track the seasonality of trees in order to ensure that they obtain nutrition from all the major groups. They also consume some amount of greenery and foliage. They eat insects for proteins, and they also have many very different strategies of obtaining this food. Sometimes they forage in a group, sometimes they forage individually, sometimes they have small hunts in other species like baboons, for example, but we don't find baboons in India. And so there are many different strategies that monkeys can employ for foraging. And what's really interesting is that primates are extremely intelligent and curious creatures, and they're constantly learning new things and adapting to newer environments and scenarios. So even if you place a primate, especially a macaque, in a new situation, it may take them a little time, but they will come up with an interesting solution to solve those problems and get access to the food that they hadn't seen before. So that's something very interesting with omnivores and generalist species in India, where you will find them in many different habitats foraging on a vast variety of foods. There's also heavy provisioning which occurs in countries like India, especially, where we also pin a lot of religious significance and cultural significance to primates. There is the Hindu god Hanuman and the general respect towards a lot of wildlife in many cultures and even in animistic religions of many indigenous communities. And because of these things, we find that it gives us good karma, or generally we just enjoy interacting with species that are comfortable around humans, like bonnet and rhesus macaques, for example. And a lot of feeding of these primates takes place along highways, in temples, and generally in people's backyards if they live in a countryside or a semi-urban area. So this is something that is largely contested, and the bottom line is that it's not a good thing to provision monkeys with food, or any wild animal for that matter. Very technically, it isn't allowed as per the Wildlife Protection Act, but even apart from that, there are many negative consequences for the species if we continuously provision them with food. It alters their cultures drastically. It changes the nutrition content in their diet. It leads to much larger and often more aggressive troops. And simply the fact that these macaques persist excessively in areas with high tourist and religious populations of people who encourage a lot of feeding of macaques. They also hang around highways and dangerous urban areas, and you also find a lot of roadkill and electrocution as a result of it. So this is something that we should really think about. Um, then we come to grooming in primates. So this is something that's one of my favorite things to watch when I'm studying primates, or just looking at any group for that matter. And that's of grooming. This is a very important social activity and contributes largely to their health and social bonding. This is something that is done mainly to keep them clean, to remove mites and other parasites or other pieces of dust and dirt from their coats. This is how they keep clean. When grooming occurs within the same species, it's called allo grooming, and this is something that is done to build relationships between individuals of a troop. You will find individuals of similar hierarchies and similar sections of a troop grooming one another, or those lower down in the hierarchy grooming those higher up in the hierarchy. And it says a lot about your social status when you observe who is grooming whom. It's also an important way to build trust within a troop of macaques, and this is just as important in a primate community as it is in any human community. So grooming is something that is relaxing, but it's also extremely important to the overall life of a primate. Then we come to more fun things like playtime in primates. And this is something that many primatologists have studied for decades now. And there is absolutely no doubt that this is immensely fun. It's a recreational activity done largely by the infants and subadults in any troop, but you also do see some amount of involvement in playtime from adults, depending on their various personalities. And this is something that really helps them build all of the motor and physical skills required to survive in the wild. Idle play or playing alone or playing in groups helps them build many skills, like how to trust one another, how to move through a forest, how to forage on different kinds of products, how to use various substrates. It helps them develop dexterity and get better control of their bodies, and it leads to an overall development of their minds as well. So there is also a correlation that has been found between how much an individual plays and the development of their brain cells as they grow older. So while play is extremely fun and entertaining to watch, it's also something that's very crucial to the upbringing and growth of an infant macaque. Then there is the matter of tool use in primates. Now, this is something which was absolutely revolutionary when it was first discovered in primates. Way before serious primatology work had begun, which means even before people like Jane Goodall had studied species like the chimpanzee. It was thought that human beings were the only ones who could use and modify tools in order to do different tasks. People were the only ones who could modify their surroundings, could use their own bodies, and also create tools and implements in order to cut, to access food, and perform other activities. But gradually, it was found that primates are one of the widest groups of animals that use tools on a regular basis, and not just use any tools but actually even modify them to perfectly fit the task at hand. So here you find a capuchin using a stone of the exact required size and shape and weight to break into a cashew nut here. And this is something that takes them time to develop the skills for. This is not something that every capuchin can do. This is something that the infants observe adults doing slowly over the years, and only when they are of the right body size to actually conduct this activity and have figured out exactly with what kind of stones to use and in what angle to hit them with how much force, that they're actually able to do it, which is something that points at incredible learning abilities in these primates. And it's something that we initially thought only humans were capable of, but now know that most primates are able to properly learn and imbibe cultures and knowledge from one another in a troop. Here you can see a chimpanzee using a stick that it has cleaned entirely of its leaves and branches in order to poke into an anthill to extract ants that are inside to consume. And here at the bottom, you see a rhesus macaque baby using a stick to clean its teeth. So these are various kinds of tool use that occur. And there are, of course, many more examples, and we are still uncovering many of them. So this is something, again, which is very interesting. Communication and vocalizations in primates is something which we really need to study a lot more. Primates communicate in many ways. They use body language, they use vocalizations, they use movements. So there is teeth baring, there is opening up of their eyes really wide. There are certain stances that they take to communicate, whether they are submissive, whether they are dominant, whether they want to threaten somebody. There's a certain bodily appearance they take on when they want to show that they are scared or cowering. So there are many intricate ways in which primates communicate with one another. There's also the communication through touch, where a gentle touch, a grip, the way in which one primate individual holds another, or with which part of the body, all of these things say very crucial things in communication. There's also vocalizations, which I'll play two or three of them for you to get a better idea of what the large repertoire of sounds that these animals can make. The picture that you see is that of howler monkeys. They are the loudest mammal or terrestrial mammal that exists. Their calls can go as far as 5 kilometers through a forest. If a howler monkey is calling, there's no way you can't hear it. So they are extremely interesting species. So the first recording that I'm going to play for you is that of the Nicobar long-tailed macaques. This is a recording that I had made while studying them. So what you're going to hear now are the contact calls between them, which means when they are in the same area, but they still want to communicate with one another and let each other know that they're still around or that they want to move on to the next location. These are the kind of sounds that they make to communicate that. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, sorry, it's just getting a little stuck. Right. So while this fixes itself, so in India, I think, say one of the most prominent primates known best for their vocalizations are the gibbons. And when you're in a forest and gibbons begin to call, you can actually feel the calls go through your body. They're really, really loud and resonant, and sometimes they are multi-directional. So you may not even be able to pinpoint exactly where the calls are coming from when they are at their loudest. Um, but when you narrow in on the actual location, you can tell where the sounds are coming from. And the Western Hulok gibbons are very, very well known for these vocalizations. It's something that that they uh, sorry, one second, I'm just restarting this. Yeah, so that's something they're very well known for, and they largely vocalize in order to establish territoriality. So at dawn and dusk is when you hear the nuclear families of gibbons calling out, and the infants, the female, the male, all of them call in unison, and they actually have songs and they practice regularly. And different families of gibbons actually have different kinds of vocalizations, and if you listen in closely regularly, you'll find that each family has a slightly different song consisting of the similar notes. Yeah, okay, so this has restarted. I'm just going to share it with you again. So I'm not going to play the calls right now, just in case we have issues, but I can share them with you all later. So since we are running out of time, I'll just quickly talk a little bit about threats and conservation of primates. Um, Going back a little bit in history, in the last century, there was heavy export of rhesus macaques, especially for medical experimentation to the Western continents. And this was done largely by pharmaceutical companies. And this was before the Wildlife Protection Act of India was reinstated. But this came to an end around the 70s. However, even after the stopping of the export of macaques for experimenting, there is still a lot of prevalent illegal wildlife pet trade, largely to do with the lorises. These are animals which across the world, not only Indian species, but even other species of lorises are considered to be extremely cute, and they are maintained at home in these little cages, and it's really not the way in which wild animals ought to be kept. There's also heavy habitat loss and fragmentation, and this is something that affects many primates and other wildlife, but especially affects these two primates in our country. One is the lion-tailed macaque that requires canopy to move and rarely uses the ground, and same for the gibbons. Gibbons are extremely clumsy on the ground and are extremely vulnerable to predators. So anytime a gibbon does not have enough canopy to continue moving through the forest, they are entirely locked in and cut off. So with the lion-tailed macaques, one good example of how we can deal with some of these problems while we restore habitats and bring back the forest which is currently lost is that of making canopy bridges and corridors across high canopy areas. So for example, when you have habitat degradation and a road going through it, the macaques can't really move from one side of the road to another. So these canopy bridges that have been built are ways in which we can continue allowing for movement across these habitats. There's also a lot of hunting and retaliatory killing for crop damages and foraging, which happens especially on part of macaques and some langur species. So I have not wanted to put in any gory pictures here, which is why you can just see a picture of a rhesus macaque eating a bit of mango there. Yeah, but so the thing is, a lot of indigenous communities still hunt primates for meat, and in many parts of the country there is heavy foraging on crops that is done by the primates, and for those who suffer heavy losses because of this, they often hunt down these macaques and kill them in order to control their population on their own. Of course, this is illegal, but it often goes unnoticed. Another issue that I spoke about earlier with you guys is that of roadkills, electrocution, and poisoning of primates that enter urban areas and use habitats that are not suitable for them. And this is something that we can help resolve by reducing provisioning of monkeys, discouraging their use of places by leaving out large quantities of food that are easily available to them and things like that. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm sorry to have slightly overshot time, but there's a lot to talk about 22 species of macaques. So I still feel like I've left out a whole lot.
Thank you so much, Ishika. We really had a very good time. So every weekend we are coming with more such interesting webinars on different themes of wildlife. So please follow us to get more updates. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.